They said, "Sorry, we're one short." That's all she said, my daughter-in-law, standing at the head of the table she'd set like a stage. 7 plates, 7 cloth napkins folded like swans, 7 silver forks that gleamed under the chandelier she'd chosen for its subtle modern aesthetic. 7. There were 8 of us in the room, and the missing plate was mine. She said it lightly, like a joke, with that effortless tone of social cruelty people perfect when they want to seem kind while cutting you out of the picture. I heard the words, and I felt them land inside me, not as a wound exactly, but as a confirmation of something that had been building for years. The slow thinning of space around me, the air tightening until my presence was just a formality. I am 76 now. I live alone in a rented apartment that smells of the sea and old paint. The walls are thin. I can hear the upstairs neighbor's radio in the mornings and the stray cats fighting in the alley at night. I keep the windows open because silence frightens me more than noise. I used to live in a house filled with people. My husband's laugh echoing down the hall, my son running through the rooms with jam on his face, music playing in the kitchen while I cooked on Sundays. But that was another century of my life. These days, my meals are simple, my mornings are quiet, and my phone barely rings. I tell myself that peace is better than company that feels like duty. But even peace has a temperature, and sometimes it turns cold. That night, though, when she said it, "Sorry, we're one short," I didn't feel cold. I felt heat. The kind that rises from humiliation and disbelief. The kind that burns from the inside out while your face stays frozen in a polite smile. I had arrived early, as I always do, carrying a casserole dish still warm from the oven, the one recipe my late husband adored, the one my son used to beg for every birthday. I had wrapped it in foil, tied a ribbon around the handles, thinking it would look festive on their long oak table. When I rang the bell, Megan opened the door with her usual tight smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. "Oh, Elena, you're early," she said, glancing at her watch as if my punctuality were an inconvenience. She took the dish from my hands, turned toward the kitchen, and called over her shoulder, "We might not have space on the table this time. We're doing a new layout." A new layout, as though a human being were a centerpiece that could be swapped out for better symmetry. Inside, the house was warm, perfumed with something citrusy and expensive. The table stretched almost the full length of the room, covered with a white linen cloth and eucalyptus branches arranged with magazine precision. I remember the soft hum of conversation, the clink of glasses, the smell of roasted chicken and rosemary, and the vague, sinking knowledge that I was a guest in a life that had once been mine. My son, David, came toward me, handsome and uncomfortable, his shirt neatly pressed, his hair graying at the temples in a way that made him look older than his years. "Mom," he said, half smiling, "you look nice. Glad you could make it." As if it were optional, as if I were some distant relative invited out of obligation. I wanted to say, "You're welcome for your childhood. For every meal, every night I stayed up sewing costumes, for school plays. For the years I worked 2 jobs so you could have piano lessons." But I just nodded and said, "Congratulations on your promotion," because old women who speak honestly are called bitter, and I didn't want to give her that satisfaction. I stood for a while, watching as they poured wine, adjusted chairs, and made small talk about vacations and renovations. Megan floated between guests like a hostess on television, laughing at the right moments, brushing invisible dust from the table, and never once looking at me for longer than a second. When the last person sat down, she counted quickly, frowning slightly. "Oh," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "we're one short." Her voice carried that false brightness people use when they're pretending to be surprised. I must have miscounted. Then she laughed, a small, tinkling sound, and looked at David. "Do we have another plate?" He hesitated. There was a pause so sharp you could hear the knife slide across the roast. He said, "It's fine. Mom doesn't mind. She can share with me." But Megan shook her head. "No, the table's balanced now. It's okay, really." And then she moved on to pouring more wine. Balanced. That word. Balanced because I wasn't sitting there. No one told me to sit down. No one told me to leave. I hovered by the sideboard, pretending to help, my hands finding comfort in busy work. I rearranged napkins, poured water, laughed at things I didn't hear. At one point, the youngest grandchild, Emma, looked up at me and whispered, "Grandma, aren't you going to eat?" Before I could answer, Megan touched her shoulder and said, "Let Grandma rest, sweetheart. Rest." As if invisibility were a form of rest. I smiled at the child and said, "I'm fine, darling," because children learn cruelty by watching how we accept it. The dinner stretched on. Plates emptied. Conversations overlapped. Laughter echoed around the table I wasn't part of. Every so often, David looked at me with that pleading expression of a man who knows something wrong is happening, but lacks the courage to stop it. That was the worst part. Not her malice, but his silence. The silence of sons is the longest echo in a mother's life. I felt it then, vibrating under my ribs, reminding me that love, when mixed with fear, becomes cowardice. When dessert was served, my dish stayed on the counter, untouched. Megan announced, "We're doing something light tonight, just fruit and sorbet." She said it as she lifted a perfect glass bowl from the refrigerator, the kind of dessert that photographs well but satisfies no one. I wanted to say, "The casserole would have fed you," but I said nothing. I just watched as they ate, the light from the chandelier glinting off the silver forks, the laughter rising like smoke from a fire that no longer warmed me. I left before coffee. No one noticed at first. I slipped my coat from the back of a chair and waited in the hallway for someone to say my name, to ask where I was going. No one did. I stood there long enough to hear Megan's voice float through the dining room. "It turned out perfectly, didn't it? The table looked so clean." Clean. That's what I was. Something removed to preserve the aesthetic. Outside, the night was damp and still. I walked down the driveway slowly, heels clicking against the stones, the air smelling faintly of jasmine and car exhaust. My car sat under the streetlight, old and reliable, the one thing left that still belonged entirely to me. As I opened the door, I saw my reflection in the window. A tired woman with careful hair, lipstick fading, eyes too bright for her own good. I thought, you shouldn't be surprised. Cruelty, when practiced long enough, becomes choreography. You learn the steps without realizing it. I drove home with the windows half open, the wind tangling my hair. The road was almost empty, and the world outside the windshield felt both larger and more distant than it had in years. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel sadness in the familiar way. What I felt was recognition, the slow, sinking certainty that I had overstayed my welcome in a life that no longer had room for me. The lights of their house disappeared in the rearview mirror, and I thought, this is the last time I will drive this road as someone's mother. When I reached my apartment, I set the casserole dish on the counter, still warm but untouched. I unwrapped it carefully, cut a small piece, and ate standing up. It tasted like memory, sweet, heavy, and pointless. Then I washed the dish, dried it with the same towel I'd owned for decades, and placed it back on the shelf. I remember thinking how strange it was that everything I needed fit into one small kitchen. That night, before going to bed, I sat by the window with a cup of tea and watched the streetlights flicker against the fog. I thought of my husband, gone 15 years now, and wondered what he would have said if he'd seen that dinner. Probably nothing. He would have squeezed my hand under the table and whispered, "Let them think they're winning." He always said pride was a young person's luxury. But sitting there alone, tea growing cold, I realized pride was all I had left, and it wasn't a luxury. It was oxygen. I stayed by the window until dawn, listening to the city waking up, to the faint sound of gulls in the distance. Somewhere inside me, a quiet voice spoke. Not the voice of anger or self-pity, but of exhaustion. It said, "That was the last dinner." I didn't argue. I simply nodded, set my empty cup down, and waited for morning to arrive. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I noticed was the smell of yesterday's humiliation still hanging in the air, faint but stubborn, like the echo of a perfume you once loved and now can't stand. I had slept in my clothes, too tired to care, the imprint of my bracelet still pressed into my wrist. The apartment was quiet, except for the slow hum of the refrigerator and the tapping of rain against the window pane. I sat there at the edge of my bed for a long while, trying to remember if the dinner had really happened the way I thought it had, or if I had exaggerated it in my mind, turned a small oversight into a tragedy. That's what I'd been trained to believe, after all. That I made things bigger than they were, that I was too sensitive, too emotional, too everything that makes it easy to dismiss a woman once she's past usefulness. But then I saw the empty casserole dish on the counter, washed, dried, and cold. Proof. I hadn't imagined it. They had eaten without me. At 10, my phone buzzed. It was a message from David. "Mom, we're heading out to brunch with Megan's parents. Thanks for coming last night. Everyone said it was such a lovely evening. Hope you got home safe." Nothing else. No apology, no recognition, not even a word about the dish I had carried like a peace offering. I read it twice and realized that "thanks for coming" was his way of closing the door. There was a time when I would have responded politely, softened the edges, tried to preserve whatever fragile thread still connected us. But that morning, something inside me refused to cooperate. I put the phone down without answering, walked to the kitchen, and made coffee. It tasted burnt, bitter, exactly right for the day after being erased. Rain fell harder by noon. The world outside my window blurred into gray shapes, cars crawling by, a dog shaking water from its fur, a woman in a red coat running for shelter. I had nowhere to be, no one expecting me, and the absence of obligation felt as heavy as grief. I thought of calling my sister, but she had her own quiet life hundreds of miles away, and the habit of saying, "Oh, families are complicated," as if that excused cruelty. I poured a second cup of coffee and stood by the window, tracing the outline of each drop as it slid down the glass. And for a moment I imagined my life like that. Small streaks of effort disappearing into something larger, unacknowledged, unremembered. It was around 3 in the afternoon when the phone rang again. I almost didn't pick up, but the persistence of the sound irritated me into obedience. It was Megan. "Elena," she said in that syrupy tone she reserved for polite emergencies. "I just wanted to check in. Are you all right? You left a bit early last night." And David was worried you might have felt uncomfortable. The word hung in the air like a trap. I could hear the rehearsed innocence in her voice, the pretense of concern polished to perfection. I said nothing for a moment, listening to the faint clatter of dishes in the background, the hum of her perfect home. Finally, I said, I was fine, just tired. She exhaled with relief that wasn't relief at all, more like satisfaction that I'd accepted the script. Good, she said quickly. We were just saying how nice it is to have everyone together. It's so hard to balance space with family sometimes, isn't it? I'm sure you understand. And then she laughed lightly, as if she'd just said something charming instead of cruel. Something shifted in me then, not a sudden explosion, not rage, just a quiet, decisive tilt, like a door clicking shut. I realized she wasn't calling to apologize. She was calling to seal the story, to make sure I stayed small enough to fit in the version she'd tell later. She'd say I was distant, maybe a little fragile, that I left because crowds tired me, that she tried her best. The lies would be gentle, the kind that make people nod sympathetically and move on. I saw it all clearly, like a script already written. And I thought, no more of this. No more being grateful for crumbs from people who built their lives on my labor. After we hung up, I opened the cupboard above the sink and pulled down the old tin box where I kept papers that mattered. Insurance forms, the deed to the house I once owned with my husband, the small stack of certificates from jobs I'd taken after his death, and the faded photograph of David as a boy with his first bicycle. His face in that picture, bright, proud, unafraid, made my throat tighten. I'd loved him with a devotion that had no boundary. And somehow that devotion had become invisible, absorbed into the background of his adult life like wallpaper behind expensive frames. I realized I had been living like that too, part of the decor of other people's narratives. The rain stopped near evening. I put on my coat and went outside. The street smelled of wet asphalt and lilac. My legs ached from disuse. But I walked anyway, past the bakery that had closed 2 years ago, past the laundromat with its flickering sign, down to the small park where children used to play. It was empty now except for a man feeding pigeons and a teenager scrolling on his phone under the shelter. I sat on a bench, feeling the dampness soak through my skirt, and watched the birds fight over crumbs. That was when the thought arrived. Not like lightning, not even like resolve, but like the slow rise of a tide. I'm done waiting for invitations. It didn't mean I knew what came next. It meant I was no longer asking permission to exist. By the time I got home, it was dark. The hallway smelled of old paint and someone's overcooked stew. I switched on the lamp and looked around my small apartment, at the mismatched furniture, the fading curtains, the photos on the shelf. All the remnants of a life that had once seemed temporary. I had always imagined I'd move in with David one day, help with the grandchildren, bake on weekends, be part of something larger than myself again. But that dream, I realized, had been built on someone else's property, and they'd quietly evicted me from it. I sat down at the table with a notepad and a pen and began to list what I actually owned. The handwriting wavered a little, but the act steadied me. The list was short. Savings account, small pension, furniture, a car, a few pieces of jewelry. Enough to live, not enough to be trapped. When I finished, I drew a line underneath and wrote, almost without thinking, Port Haven. It was the name of a coastal town 2 hours north, where my husband and I had once spent a weekend long ago, before David was born, before the world shrank into responsibility and habit. I didn't even know why I wrote it, only that the memory of that place felt like breath after years of holding it in. I went to bed early, but sleep didn't come. I lay there listening to the sound of the pipes ticking, the occasional car passing outside, and the restless thought circling in my head. What if I just left? It wasn't a fantasy of escape. It was a question of dignity. What if the only way to be seen was to disappear on my own terms? Around midnight, I got up, opened the closet, and took out a small suitcase. I placed it on the bed and unzipped it. The sound of the zipper felt final, decisive, like a blade cutting through fabric. I didn't start packing yet. I just stared at the empty space inside it, the potential of it, and thought, this is what freedom looks like before it becomes real. Somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, I made a cup of tea and sat by the window again. The street was deserted now, the lamplight pooling on the wet pavement. I thought about how many times I had stayed silent to keep the peace, how many times I'd swallowed the truth because speaking it would have embarrassed someone else. And for what? So they could say at dinner parties that they took good care of Mom? I realized that night that care without respect is just management. They didn't care for me. They managed me. When the first light appeared at the edge of the sky, pale and cold, I felt something inside me unclench. I wasn't angry anymore. Not exactly. Anger requires expectation, and I had none left. What I felt was something deeper, cleaner, a kind of clarity that doesn't shout. I finished my tea, rinsed the cup, and looked around the room one last time. The walls looked almost translucent in the dawn light, the kind of fragile brightness that comes before change. I whispered to the silence, "This ends here." And just like that, the decision was made, not with drama, not with tears, but with the steady breath of someone who has finally understood the difference between being needed and being used. The betrayal wasn't in the missing plate. The betrayal was in all the quiet ways they'd trained me to believe I was lucky to be invited at all. That morning, as the sun rose, I decided I would stop waiting to be served. I would set my own table somewhere far from their house of polished glass and hidden knives. I didn't leave right away. Decisions made in the dark need daylight to harden into truth. And the next morning, when I woke, the courage I'd felt during the night had softened, replaced by the kind of dull caution that comes from decades of trying not to make waves. I moved slowly through my apartment, folding the same kitchen towel twice before hanging it back on its hook, tidying objects that didn't need tidying. I told myself I should at least wait until David called again, or until Megan's birthday next month, or maybe until after winter when travel would be easier. Every excuse sounded reasonable enough, but underneath each was the same old fear, the fear of being the one who left, of confirming what they already believed, that I was difficult, unstable, too proud to be helped. Yet even as I made these quiet bargains with myself, I knew they were temporary. A life that depends on other people's comfort is no life at all, and I had been living in borrowed air for too long. 2 days passed. The phone stayed silent. I checked it occasionally, not out of hope, but out of habit. The way one glances at a window expecting to see rain long after the clouds have cleared. There was nothing. No missed calls, no messages, not even one of those polite, checking-in texts people send when they want to feel kind without actually being so. I realized then that silence wasn't an accident. It was a system. It had been their favorite form of discipline for years. When I said something they didn't like, they went quiet. When I asked to visit, they forgot to reply. When I sent gifts for the children, I sometimes didn't even receive a thank you. The silence was their way of teaching me my place, and I had learned the lesson too well. By the third morning, the air inside the apartment felt stale, thick with thoughts that looped back on themselves. I opened every window and let in the chill November air until my fingers went numb. Across the courtyard, a woman in a bathrobe was hanging laundry on a line. She looked about my age, and I envied her casual efficiency, the ease with which she handled the simple rhythm of her own day. I wondered if she, too, had been someone's mother, someone's afterthought. That image stayed with me. A woman hanging her own life piece by piece, letting it dry in the cold. That afternoon, I found the small notebook where I used to write grocery lists and reminders. I tore out the pages that had lists of chores or prescriptions, leaving only the clean ones, and I began to write, not letters this time, just sentences that drifted in and out like weather. I have been quiet for too long. No one remembers who paid the first deposit on that house. Kindness can rot if it never receives light. They weren't confessions or plans, more like a slow reclamation of voice. I filled 5 pages before my hand started trembling. When I stopped, I realized I hadn't written in first person for years. All my notes had been about other people, calls to make, birthdays to remember, bills to pay. It had taken less than 3 days of silence to make me remember what my own handwriting looked like when it wasn't serving someone else. That evening, I decided to go for a walk again. The streets were slick from rain, and puddles mirrored the glow of the streetlights. I passed the corner store, the one that always smelled faintly of fried onions, and bought a loaf of bread and a small jar of honey. The young man at the counter asked if I needed a bag. I said no, carrying the warm loaf in my hands like something alive. It struck me how long it had been since I'd done something so ordinary without feeling watched or judged. When I reached home, I sliced the bread, poured a cup of tea, and ate in silence. It was such a simple act, but the steadiness of it felt almost rebellious. Later that night, as I sat in the living room with the television playing softly, I noticed the framed photo of David on the bookshelf, the one from his college graduation, me beside him, smiling proudly, the world still uncomplicated. I studied it for a long time, tracing the outlines of that younger woman who believed love could fix anything. I thought about calling him, thought about saying something casual like, just checking in. But I knew how that conversation would go. He'd sound relieved but distracted, promise to visit soon, and by the end of the call, I'd be the one apologizing again. I turned off the television instead and went to bed with the photo face down. Sleep came in waves that night, shallow and unsettled. In one dream, I was standing in Megan's kitchen again, watching them laugh around the table while I searched for my missing plate. In another, I was walking through a vast, empty airport, every gate announcing departures to cities I'd never see. I woke before dawn with my heart racing, the sheets twisted around my legs like vines. There was no noise, just that strange pre-morning stillness when everything feels suspended. I went to the window and watched the sky change colors from slate to pearl. Somewhere between those shades, I understood that waiting for permission was another form of captivity. The next day, I began sorting through my belongings. At first, it was just practical, donating clothes that no longer fit, throwing away expired medicine. But soon it became ritual. Each drawer I opened seemed to hold a version of myself I no longer recognized. The pastel scarves I'd worn to Megan's luncheons, the shoes I'd bought because they looked respectable, the silverware set David had once said would be more suitable for guests. Every item told the same story. I had built myself out of other people's preferences. By the time I reached the bottom of the closet, surrounded by neatly folded piles and discarded hangers, I felt both lighter and lonelier than I'd ever felt before. That evening, I received a voicemail from an old friend named Nora. We hadn't spoken in years. "Just heard from someone at church that you're back in town," her voice said. "You should come by for tea sometime. Thursdays around 2. I listened twice, wondering who had told her I was here. Technically, I'd never left. But her message stirred something gentle in me. I didn't call back right away, but I saved the message. It was proof that my name still existed somewhere beyond their dinner table. On Thursday, I went. Nora lived in a narrow house with peeling paint and too many potted plants. She opened the door, looked at me for a long second, and said, "You look tired, but less lost than I expected." It wasn't a compliment, but it made me laugh. We talked for hours about nothing important. Gardens, weather, television shows neither of us liked. But beneath it all was a quiet understanding, a shared knowledge of what it means to outlive your usefulness in the eyes of your own family. When I left, she hugged me tightly and said, "Come again. We old ones have to keep each other visible." That sentence stayed with me. Keep each other visible. The next week passed like that. Small outings, long silences, slow realizations. I started noticing things I'd ignored for years. The way sunlight moved across my kitchen counter, the rhythm of footsteps from the apartment above, the faint smell of coffee from the cafe downstairs. It was as if the world, stripped of noise, had turned the volume up on the smallest sounds. I began walking every morning, just a few blocks at first, then longer, until I found myself at the train station one afternoon, watching people board and depart. There was something hypnotic about it, the clean efficiency of leaving. That night, I pulled the suitcase from under my bed again. This time I didn't just stare at it. I opened my dresser drawers and began to pack. Slowly, deliberately, folding each item like a decision. 3 dresses, 2 sweaters, my warm coat, the photograph of my husband, a book of poems, the notebook with the sentences. I placed them all inside and zipped it shut. The sound didn't startle me this time. It sounded like breathing. Before sleeping, I left a note on the kitchen table, not addressed to anyone in particular, just words that needed to exist outside my head. If anyone ever asks, tell them I went to find a place where 7 plates aren't the limit of love. I didn't know who might find it or if anyone ever would. Maybe it was for me, a promise written in ink instead of air. I lay in bed, eyes open, waiting for doubt to come creeping back. But it didn't. There was only calm, a deep, unwavering calm that felt almost holy. I thought of the woman across the courtyard hanging her laundry, of Nora pouring tea, of all the invisible women who quietly rebuilt their lives after being dismissed. Somewhere out there, I imagined, they were breathing the same cool night air, whispering the same prayer. Let me not disappear before I'm truly gone. When the alarm clock blinked 6 o'clock, I rose without hesitation. The streets were still half asleep, the sky pale and uncommitted. I locked the door behind me, suitcase in hand, and walked toward the bus stop. The first bus would take me to the train, and the train, wherever it went, would take me somewhere new. My feet hurt, my back ached, but I kept walking. Behind me, the city yawned awake, indifferent. Ahead, the horizon stretched open like a page waiting to be written. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like an afterthought. I felt like a beginning. The train moved with that steady rhythm that makes you believe time can be rewritten if you ride far enough. I sat by the window, watching towns dissolve into fields and the fields give way to water, the horizon widening with every mile. My ticket read Port Haven, one way, printed in small, unassuming letters that somehow looked more like freedom than any poem I'd ever read. I didn't know exactly what waited for me there, only that I could no longer stay where I'd been. Sometimes leaving isn't an act of bravery. It's an instinct for survival that finally wins the argument. The motion of the train lulled me into a quiet trance, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel curiosity instead of fear. I was no longer running away from the house with 7 plates. I was walking towards something that might still have space for me. When I arrived, the sky was low and gray, the kind of coastal weather that smells of salt and iron. Port Haven hadn't changed much from what I remembered. A scattering of old buildings along the main street, a harbor full of stubborn boats, gulls circling like impatient ghosts. I dragged my suitcase across uneven pavement and stopped in front of a narrow cafe with fogged windows. A chalkboard sign outside said, "Rooms for rent upstairs. Inquire within." The lettering wobbled, as if written by a tired hand. Inside, the cafe was half empty, the air thick with the smell of coffee and wet coats. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a cigarette resting in the corner of her mouth. She looked me over without speaking, then said, "You looking for the room or the coffee?" "The room," I answered. "Maybe the coffee later." She nodded, wiped her hands on a towel, and motioned for me to follow. The staircase was narrow and creaked underfoot. The room she showed me was small. A bed, a sink, a window that faced the harbor. But it was clean, and the radiator was already hissing softly. "Rent's weekly, cash," she said. "No nonsense, no guests, no drama." "That sounds perfect," I said. She gave me the key, and that was that. No contract, no pretense, no welcome speech. Just the exchange of 2 women who had long ago stopped expecting life to be easy. When she left, I stood by the window for a long time, watching the slow movement of the water. There was something comforting in the ordinariness of it. The boats bumping gently against the docks, the gulls screaming over crumbs, the occasional couple walking arm in arm. I unpacked my few things and made the bed, smoothing the blanket with unnecessary care, as if order could disguise how lost I felt. Later, I went downstairs for that coffee. The woman introduced herself as Ruth. "You staying long?" she asked. "I'm not sure yet." "Well, people who say that usually stay longer than they plan." We shared a small smile. She poured me a cup and sat across from me without invitation. "You running from something?" she asked. "Not running. Just done waiting," I said. "That's the same thing," she replied, lighting another cigarette. It was such a simple exchange, yet it grounded me. In her matter-of-fact tone, there was no pity, no curiosity sharpened into gossip. She spoke to me like one adult to another, not like someone humoring an old woman who had lost her way. That night, when I returned to my room, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, belonging, however temporary. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. I woke early, made instant coffee with the little kettle Ruth lent me, and walked along the pier until the cold wind chased me back inside. Sometimes I helped her wipe tables or refill sugar jars just to keep my hands busy. She paid me with free meals, though I never asked. One morning she said, "You're good with people. You should work a few shifts if you want." The girl who used to help me ran off with some fishermen. So I started helping at the cafe, not for the money, but for the steadiness of routine. There was something healing about serving coffee to strangers, about hearing snippets of lives that had nothing to do with mine. I learned the fishermen's names, the favorite pastries of the regulars, the particular way Ruth liked the cups stacked. Each task was small, but each held weight. After decades of being useful only when needed, I had found usefulness that asked for nothing in return. In the evenings, I walked by the harbor. The air smelled of seaweed and diesel, the sky sometimes clear, sometimes heavy with fog. I would buy a newspaper, though I rarely read it, and sit on a bench watching the lights flicker across the water. The sound of waves against the rocks became my clock. Nights were colder than I remembered, but the quiet wrapped around me like an old coat that still fit. One Saturday, as I was wiping the counter, Ruth asked, "Don't you ever call your family? Someone must be missing you." I hesitated. "If they do, they haven't said so." She studied me for a moment, then shrugged. "Sometimes disappearing is the only way to see who looks for you." I didn't answer. Her words lingered long after she turned away, echoing somewhere deep inside. I thought about my son's silence, about the way absence becomes an inconvenience for those who never noticed your presence. I realized I didn't want to be found yet. I wasn't hiding. I was growing roots in a place where no one expected me to bloom. As the weeks passed, I began to recognize myself again, not the version shaped by someone else's politeness, but the woman who had once known how to start over. I bought a coat from a second-hand shop, navy blue wool with deep pockets. The first time I wore it, Ruth said, "You look like you've got a secret." I told her maybe I did. The truth was, that coat made me feel like a person who still had choices. One evening, while closing the cafe, I found a small flyer pinned to the bulletin board by the door. It read, "Help Wanted, Morning Shift, Coastal Diner, Main Street." I tore it off and slipped it into my pocket. The next morning, I went to the diner and asked about the job. The manager, a woman named Helen with tired eyes and a kind smile, looked me up and down and said, "You've ever worked in food service?" "I've worked in families," I said. "Which is the same thing, only with less pay." She laughed softly and handed me an apron. "You can start tomorrow, 6 a.m. That first morning was hard on my body. The early hours, the endless movement, but my mind felt alive. I poured coffee, cleared plates, smiled when I didn't have to, and listened to the hum of conversation around me. By the end of the shift, my feet ached, but my heart felt solid, anchored. Helen paid me in cash and said, "If you want to keep coming back, you're welcome." I nodded, pocketing the bills. I hadn't earned money that was entirely my own in over a decade. When I returned to my small room, I spread the bills on the table and stared at them. It wasn't much, just a few crumpled notes, but they were mine, untouched by anyone else's permission. I folded them carefully and slipped them into the pages of my notebook between two lines I had written weeks before. No one owes you a seat at their table. Build your own and see who joins. That night, I made myself a simple dinner. Bread, cheese, and a small glass of wine Ruth insisted I take. The room was quiet except for the faint sound of the sea. I thought of David and the children, of Megan's careful smile, and for the first time, the thought didn't hurt. It just existed, like a painting you can finally look at without stepping inside it. Before bed, I opened the window. The wind carried the scent of the tide and a distant bell from a boat coming in late. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. I was still alone, still uncertain about what came next. But I wasn't lost anymore. I had made it to the midpoint of something that felt like a life, not a waiting room. And as I stood there in the thin silver light, I whispered to no one, "I'm still here." It was early December when the first letter arrived, tucked beneath the cafe door one morning before I came in for my shift. The envelope was thin, my name written in a rushed hand that I knew before I even opened it. "Grandma, where are you?" That was the first line. No greeting, no hesitation, just a young man's voice reaching out through the gaps his parents had built. The signature at the bottom said, Kieran. He was my eldest grandson, the one who used to follow me around the garden when he was small, helping me pick tomatoes and asking endless questions about the world. He'd grown quiet over the years, retreating into the gray silence of his parents' house, and I had stopped hearing from him, except for the occasional thank you text after birthdays. Seeing his handwriting again felt like sunlight after a long tunnel. He wrote that everyone was worried, that his parents didn't know where I'd gone, that they were telling neighbors I might have fallen ill. He said he didn't believe that. "You're too stubborn to fall apart, Grandma. Please just let me know you're all right." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my apron pocket, my hands trembling. Ruth noticed. "Bad news?" she asked, lighting her first cigarette of the morning. "Maybe the opposite," I said. I didn't tell her everything, not yet. I carried the letter in my pocket all day, feeling its weight like a pulse against my thigh. And when I walked home that evening, I read it again under the streetlight outside the cafe. I wanted to answer immediately, but something held me back. A kind of fragile peace I wasn't ready to disturb. It wasn't fear. It was the knowledge that once you open a door, you can't control who walks through. 2 days later, a man came into the diner where I worked the morning shift. He was young, with a camera around his neck, probably a journalist or someone playing at it. He ordered coffee and a sandwich, then asked casually, "You wouldn't happen to know a woman named Elena Ward, would you? Older, maybe mid-70s, short hair, gray coat?" My hands froze around the coffee pot. "Why do you ask?" I said. He shrugged, pretending indifference. "Her family's looking for her. She's been missing for weeks. There's a piece running in the local paper about it." I managed to keep my voice even. "Can't say I've heard the name." He left a few minutes later, but his words stayed behind like the smell of burnt toast. That night, Ruth slid a newspaper across the counter toward me. "You might want to see this," she said quietly. There it was on the second page, a photo of me from some family gathering years ago, cropped awkwardly so I looked smaller than I was. Missing grandmother feared, confused, or ill. Family pleads for information. My son's name was printed below the article, followed by a quote that made my stomach turn. "We just want her home where she'll be safe." Safe. The word was poison. Ruth read the article over my shoulder, snorted, and said, "They make it sound like you wandered off chasing butterflies." I folded the paper neatly. They like stories with helpless women. "It sells sympathy." "What are you going to do about it?" she asked. "Nothing. Let them look. It's good exercise." But the truth was, the article shook me. Not because I feared being found, but because it was proof that they still needed control, even in my absence. They had turned my disappearance into a performance, a moral lesson for neighbors who adored tidy narratives. I wasn't a person to them anymore. I was a headline, an anecdote about dementia and misplaced love. That night, I sat in my small room staring at the wall until dawn, thinking about how easily people rewrite the truth when silence gives them permission. A week later, Kieran's second letter arrived. This time it was longer, his handwriting less controlled. He said his father had hired a lawyer to handle things in case I'd left important paperwork unfinished. He said his mother was angry all the time now, snapping at everyone, blaming him for defending me. I don't know what happened, Grandma, but I know you wouldn't just leave without a reason. If you're okay, please write to me. I won't tell anyone. I read the letter 3 times before I began to write back. My hands shook so much I had to start over twice. I told him I was safe, that I had found work and a small room by the sea, that I wasn't sick or confused. I didn't tell him where. I ended the letter with a line I didn't plan to write. Sometimes leaving is the only way to stay alive inside. I sealed the envelope and mailed it the next morning, my chest aching with a mix of guilt and relief. For a while, nothing happened. Winter deepened. The harbor froze at the edges, gulls hopping on the ice like confused children. Ruth's cafe stayed busy enough, and the diner gave me extra hours. I spent Christmas Eve serving coffee to strangers, and when the night finally ended, Ruth poured us both a shot of brandy. "To women who don't wait for invitations," she said, clinking her glass against mine. We drank, and for once the loneliness felt almost noble. In January, the lawyer came. He arrived at the cafe mid-morning, a tall man in a too-new suit that looked uncomfortable in salt air. "Mrs. Ward," he said, already knowing the answer, "I represent your son, David Ward. He's very concerned about your well-being." His tone was smooth, practiced, the kind used for negotiating wills and guilt. "My well-being is excellent," I said, folding a napkin with deliberate care. He cleared his throat. "There's been some confusion regarding your financial arrangements. Your son simply wants to ensure that your affairs are managed appropriately." "My affairs," I repeated, "are mine." "Of course," he said, giving a small, sympathetic smile. "But perhaps you'd consider authorizing him to act on your behalf, just to simplify matters. These things can get complicated." "Complicated for whom?" He hesitated. "For families, Mrs. Ward." I looked him straight in the eye. "My family made things complicated when they counted 7 plates for 8 people. You can tell David I've simplified it for him. I'm not coming back." His expression flickered, just for a second. Then he nodded curtly, gathered his papers, and left. Ruth watched him go and muttered, "Lawyer types always smell like fear and aftershave." That evening, I took my savings book from its hiding place and withdrew every penny from the account that bore my son's name. I opened a new one under my own, the first account I'd had in years that no one else could touch. The teller, a young woman with purple nail polish, smiled politely as she handed me the new card. "Anything else today?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Freedom, if you're offering it." She laughed, thinking I was joking. In February, another envelope came, this one thick with folded pages. It was from David. "Mom, this has gone too far. We can't have you living God knows where working in some cafe. People are talking. Megan is devastated. The children don't understand. Please be reasonable. We just want to help you." The word reasonable jumped off the page, underlined like a threat. He ended the letter with, "If you come home, we'll discuss next steps together." I read it once, then again, slower. The arrogance was almost impressive. There was no mention of the dinner, no apology, not even a hint of recognition that his silence had started this whole unraveling. I folded the pages neatly, placed them in the sink, and burned them one by one with a match from Ruth's cigarette box. The smoke rose, thin and blue, curling toward the ceiling like forgiveness I no longer owed. The next morning, I wrote 3 sentences on a piece of paper and mailed it to him. I am not missing. I am no longer available for supervision. Tell your wife the table is balanced now. After that, there were no more letters from him. Only one final message from Kieran. He said he'd read my last note to his father, and that it had caused a storm at home. I don't know if I'll get to see you again, but I'm proud of you. I didn't know grown-ups could be brave like that. I cried then, not out of sadness, but because of the quiet grace in his words. Spring crept in slowly, hesitant like an apology. The sea turned softer, the air less cruel. One afternoon, I saw a young man standing outside the diner, staring at the menu without reading it. For a moment, my heart stopped. It wasn't David, but the resemblance was sharp enough to make me dizzy. I served his table anyway, my hands steady. When he left, he thanked me for the coffee and said, "You remind me of my grandmother." "I hope she's worth the remembering," I said. "She is," he replied, and walked out into the sunlight. That night, I sat by the harbor until the cold crept through my coat. I thought of all the women who vanish from their own lives not by choice, but by exhaustion, the ones whose stories get rewritten until even they can't tell where truth ends and guilt begins. I thought of Megan polishing her perfect glasses, of David explaining to neighbors that his mother was unwell, and of Kieran, somewhere out there, old enough now to understand that love and control are not the same thing. The tide came in, soft and persistent, erasing footprints from the sand. When I went back to my room, I wrote one final letter, not to them, but to myself. You did not disappear. You stepped out of their frame. You refused to be a prop in a play that no longer deserved your presence. They can tell whatever story they need to survive, but you have earned your own version, and it begins here. I pinned the letter to the wall above my bed. Each morning since, I've read it before work, a quiet act of defiance that needs no witnesses. Sometimes Ruth catches me smiling and says, "You look like a woman who knows a secret." I tell her I do. The secret is simple. I am finally unafraid of being alone because alone is honest. Alone doesn't lie. Still, there are nights when memory presses hard against the door, when I hear echoes of my son's laughter as a child, when I see the shimmer of 7 plates beneath 2 bright lights. But even then, I remind myself that the only thing worse than being forgotten is being remembered wrong. And as long as I keep walking toward my own life, no one can write the ending for me again. It began quietly, as most irreversible things do. One morning in late April, when the light over the harbor turned that particular shade of silver that means winter is finally done, I walked into a small thrift shop at the end of Main Street. I had passed it dozens of times, always meaning to go in but never doing so. The window display was a mess of second-hand lamps, mismatched teacups, and old books whose spines had forgotten their titles. That day, something drew me inside, perhaps the promise of ordinary clutter after months of deliberate simplicity. The bell over the door jingled, and a woman emerged from behind a stack of boxes, her hair pinned loosely, her smile easy but distracted. "Everything's half off," she said. "We're clearing out before summer stock." I wandered between aisles of forgotten lives. Chipped figurines, faded scarves, a cracked mirror that reflected me twice, once as I was, and once as I might have been had I never left. Then, on a lower shelf, I saw them. 7 ceramic plates, none matching, each bearing the marks of some previous table. A blue floral pattern here, a gold rim there, one with a hairline fracture running through its center like a healed wound. They looked like orphans waiting to be claimed. I touched each one gently, my fingers tracing their imperfections, and the shopkeeper said from behind me, "You can take 8. One's free with the set." I smiled faintly and shook my head. 7 is enough. When I carried them home in a cardboard box, the weight felt symbolic, almost sacred. Ruth saw me struggling up the stairs and came to help. "You starting a collection?" she asked, setting the box on the counter. "I'm starting a table," I said. That evening, I cleared the small kitchen table in my room and laid the plates out, one beside the other, their mismatched colors glowing softly in the lamplight. For the first time in years, I felt the kind of anticipation that comes before a celebration, though there was no occasion and no guest list. I wrote a few invitations on slips of paper torn from my notebook. Simple, unpretentious words. Dinner tomorrow. No reason but being alive. Bring nothing but appetite. I slipped one under Ruth's door, gave another to Helen at the diner, one to the woman from the bookstore across the street, and left the rest with people I barely knew but saw every day. A fisherman, a postman, a girl who sold flowers from a cart. It wasn't about filling chairs. It was about declaring space. The next evening, as the sky bruised into violet, they came, one by one. Ruth first, carrying a bottle of cheap wine. "You said bring nothing," she said, "but I never listen." Then Helen arrived with a pie, the fisherman with a loaf of bread, the flower girl with a single white lily. We squeezed around the table, our knees bumping, laughter rising awkwardly at first and then freely. The plates gleamed under the small overhead bulb, each holding something different. Bread, stew, salad, memories. I poured the wine into mismatched glasses, and Ruth raised hers high. "To second beginnings," she said. We drank, and I felt something in my chest loosen, a knot years in the making finally beginning to untangle. As we ate, stories spilled out. Ruth's about her runaway husband, Helen's about losing her diner during the pandemic, the fisherman's about a storm that nearly took his life. When they asked about me, I didn't hide behind politeness. I told them about the dinner, the 7 plates, the missing one that had decided everything. I told them about my son's silence, the letters, the lawyer, the lies. No one interrupted. No one pitied. They just listened, and in that listening, the shame that had lived in me for months finally cracked open and dissolved. Ruth reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You built a new table," she said quietly. "You're not missing anymore." At some point, the flower girl began humming an old tune, something half-remembered, and soon we were all singing bits of it, off-key but sincere. The sound of our voices filled the small room until I thought the walls might burst with it. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of salt and lilac through the open window. I looked around the table, at the faces lit by laughter and candlelight, and realized that this was the life I had spent years hoping to earn through obedience, through endurance, through being small enough not to offend anyone. Yet it had arrived only when I stopped asking permission. Later, after everyone had gone and the room was quiet again, I stood by the sink, washing the plates one by one. The water ran warm over my hands, steam fogging the window. Each plate, though mismatched, felt perfect in its own right, each carrying a trace of that night's laughter, a new kind of history. I lined them up on the counter to dry, 7 bright circles in a row, and felt a calm settle over me. Not the fragile calm of surrender, but the deep stillness that comes after a storm has passed. The next morning, I walked to the post office with an envelope addressed to Kieran. Inside was a photograph of the 7 plates arranged on my table, taken with the old disposable camera Ruth kept behind the counter. On the back, I had written, "You were right. Grown-ups can be brave. Sometimes bravery looks like dinner for 7, set by 1. I mailed it without return address and didn't wait for an answer. Weeks passed. Life continued in its unremarkable rhythm, but everything inside me had shifted. I worked, I cooked, I laughed. The townspeople began to know my name. The girl from the flower cart brought me tulips every Friday. Ruth made me manager of the cafe so she could sleep late. I even bought a small radio and listened to the morning news without flinching at the world's noise. I was alive in a way that felt earned. Then one afternoon in early May, as I was locking up the cafe, a familiar voice called my name. I turned, and there he was, David, standing a few paces away, thinner than I remembered, his hair streaked with gray, his face drawn tight with confusion and something like awe. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The gulls screamed overhead. The air tasted of sea and inevitability. "Mom," he said finally, the words small, uncertain. I didn't know where else to look. "You found me anyway," I said. "I had to. I saw the picture Kieran got. The plates." He hesitated, searching my face. "You look different." "I am different," I said. He stepped closer, his hands trembling. "You scared us. We thought—" "I know what you thought," I interrupted gently. "You thought I'd lost myself, but I found what you never gave me. Room." He looked down, his voice breaking. I didn't understand. "No," I said. "You didn't want to. You learn to love women only when they stay quiet." I was quiet too long. For a while, there was only the sound of waves and the faint clatter of masts against the docks. He looked around, as if seeing the town through my eyes. "Are you happy here?" he asked finally. "Yes," I said. "I'm not rich, I'm not young, but I'm whole. That's enough." He nodded slowly. "Can I visit you again?" "Maybe," I said. "But next time, bring your own plate." Something between us shifted then. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition that the story had changed shape. He reached out as if to touch my arm, then thought better of it. "You really left for good," he whispered. I smiled. "I didn't leave, David. I arrived." He stood there for a while longer, then walked away, shoulders slightly bent, as though carrying the weight of understanding for the first time. I watched him disappear into the crowd, and instead of sadness, I felt a strange kind of mercy. For him, for myself, for all the people who only learn the value of love when it's no longer owed to them. That evening, I returned to my room and set the 7 plates on the table again, polishing them with a soft cloth. The light through the window was golden, almost tender, and I whispered into the air, "Balanced now." The words weren't bitter. They were true. I poured myself a glass of wine and raised it quietly. Not a toast to survival, but to presence. The quiet, radical act of still being here. The days that followed unfolded with the stillness of something finally settled. There were no more letters, no unexpected visitors, no questions from the past pressing against the present. The sea had grown calmer, and so had I. Every morning I opened the curtains and let the light spill across the room, soft and forgiving, the kind of light that asks nothing in return. The table stood by the window, 7 plates stacked neatly, waiting not for ceremony, but for use. I had stopped treating them as symbols and begun to see them as what they were, objects that had earned their place through imperfection, through being chosen rather than assigned. That, I realized, was what I wanted for myself all along, to be chosen freely, not kept out of duty or nostalgia. The town had begun to feel like home in the unassuming way places do when you stop comparing them to what came before. The locals greeted me by name now. Ruth had given up smoking at my quiet insistence, claiming I was a bad influence in a good way. Helen sent leftovers from the diner when she closed late, and the flower girl left small bouquets on my doorstep just because. I never asked for any of it, and maybe that was the point. Love, I'd learned, doesn't always need to be declared. Sometimes it's just a steady presence, like the hum of the tide against the rocks. One afternoon, as I was closing the cafe, Ruth handed me an envelope. "Some boy dropped this off earlier," she said, pretending indifference but watching me closely. It was from Kieran. The handwriting was steadier this time, the letters taller, more certain. "Grandma, I saw Dad after he came back from visiting you. He didn't say much, but he looked lighter. I think he understands now. I wanted to thank you for showing me that growing up doesn't mean disappearing. I hope someday I'll have your kind of courage." I sat at one of the empty tables reading the letter until the words blurred. There was no address on it, no expectation of a reply. He had written what needed to be said, and that was enough. Later that evening, I took a walk by the harbor. The wind was cool, carrying the faint scent of salt and jasmine from the hills. The water shimmered like metal under the fading sun, each wave folding into the next with the calm certainty of repetition. I thought of all the nights I had spent here, first as a woman escaping, then as one rebuilding, and now simply as someone living. I passed a young couple arguing softly by the benches, a fisherman mending his nets, a group of children chasing each other with paper boats. Life continued, indifferent and beautiful, and I realized with quiet gratitude that I was part of it again, not watching from behind the glass of someone else's story. When I returned home, I brewed tea and sat by the window. The 7 plates caught the glow of the streetlights, their uneven colors softened by the shadows. I thought of the first table, the one I had been erased from, and felt no anger, no need for vengeance or vindication. The wound had become something else, something almost tender, because it had forced me to find the edges of myself. If that night had not happened, I might still be standing by their sideboard, waiting to be invited to sit. The cruelty had been the doorway. The absence had been the teacher. I poured the tea, breathing in its warmth, and spoke aloud to the quiet room, as if to another woman listening somewhere far away. They will try to tell you that leaving means failure. They will say you're ungrateful, dramatic, impossible. But sometimes leaving is the only honest act left. When they count plates and forget yours, remember this: Your hunger is not shameful. It's the proof that you are still alive." The words came out softly, but they filled the air like incense, rising and settling everywhere. Outside, the street lamps flickered on one by one. The sound of a distant bell drifted from the harbor. I stood and opened the window, letting the night air rush in. Somewhere beyond the roofs, the world stretched wide and unknown, but I no longer needed to chase it. My story was not about escape anymore. It was about belonging to myself without apology. I thought of all the women I had known, neighbors, friends, even strangers, who had swallowed their hurt and called it patience, who had mistaken endurance for love. I wished I could gather them all here, set the table, pour wine into mismatched glasses, and tell them the truth that had taken me a lifetime to learn. That peace doesn't come from being forgiven. It comes from forgiving yourself for staying too long in places that kept you small. As the clock ticked past midnight, I finished my tea and rinsed the cup. The city outside was quiet, the sea breathing in the distance. I touched the edge of one of the plates, running my fingers along its chipped rim, and smiled. The flaw didn't diminish it. It made it real, capable of being held. Maybe that was what love was meant to be. Not perfect, not complete, but real enough to stay in your hands. Before going to bed, I turned off the light and stood for a moment in the darkness. The air was still, heavy, with that particular silence that feels like a blessing. I whispered, almost as a benediction, "I'm home." It wasn't an address or a promise. It was an acknowledgement. The story that began with an empty place at someone else's table had ended here, in a room filled with my own presence. Tomorrow would come, as it always does, and I would rise, make coffee, open the cafe, and greet whoever walked through the door. No one would know the full story of how I got here, and that was all right. The people who needed to understand already did. Somewhere beyond the horizon, another woman was probably standing in her own quiet kitchen, realizing that no one had set a plate for her. If I could speak to her now, I would tell her gently, "Don't beg for space. Build it. Don't wait to be remembered. Remember yourself." And then I would smile, pour her a cup of tea and say, "There's room for you here. Sit down. The table is already set."